What if I told you that spiritual predators follow the same behavioral patterns as human manipulators, but operate on frequencies most people can't detect? Tonight, I'm revealing the 3 laws of spiritual predation that will change how you identify entities hunting for human consciousness. These aren't random encounters. They're calculated attacks following ancient warfare patterns. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some people become spiritual prey, while others remain untouchable. The door I opened revealed tactics used for millennia to harvest human energy, and once you see these patterns, you'll never look at spiritual experiences the same way again. The most powerful spiritual defense strategy in history was hidden in plain sight for thousands of years. If you're exploring spirituality, what you're about to learn will make you immune to predatory entities. Most people don't understand that spiritual predators study you before they attack. They watch your routines, your vulnerabilities, your moments of weakness, just like any hunter studying prey. Sarah discovered this the hard way 3 months ago. She was a 34-year-old therapist from Portland, someone who prided herself on helping others navigate their darkest moments. But Sarah had one fatal flaw that made her the perfect target. She believed her compassion was her shield. It started during her evening meditation practice. Sarah had been meditating for 5 years, always in the same corner of her bedroom, always at 9 p.m. Routine, predictability. That's what they look for. The first night, she felt a presence watching her. Not hostile, just curious. Like someone peeking through curtains. Most people would have stopped meditating. Sarah, being Sarah, interpreted it as spiritual growth. I'm becoming more sensitive, she told herself. The second night, the presence felt closer. Still not threatening, but there was something different. It felt lonely, desperate. Sarah's therapist instincts kicked in. She found herself mentally reaching out, offering comfort to whatever was there. Big mistake. By the third night, the entity had learned everything it needed to know about Sarah. Her compassion wasn't random, it was compulsive. She couldn't resist helping something that seemed in pain. The entity had studied her professional life, her relationships, her entire psychological profile through their brief mental connection. What Sarah didn't realize was that she had just passed the predator's first test. She had proven she would lower her guard for something that appeared vulnerable. In the spiritual realm, this is like walking alone at night while broadcasting that you carry no weapons. The entity knew exactly how to proceed. That third night, as Sarah settled into meditation, the presence didn't just feel closer, it felt desperate, frantic, like something was wrong, terribly wrong. Sarah felt its distress washing over her in waves, and every instinct screamed at her to help. She opened her awareness completely, dropping every protective boundary she'd ever learned. "I'm here," she whispered into the darkness. "Tell me what's wrong." The moment those words left her lips, everything changed. The desperate energy shifted into something else entirely, something that had been pretending. What happened next revealed the first tactical principle of spiritual warfare that most humans never recognize. Predatory entities never attack directly. They infiltrate. The presence Sarah had invited in didn't announce itself with horror movie theatrics. No sudden cold spots, no flickering lights, no demonic growling. Instead, it became part of her internal landscape so seamlessly that she couldn't tell where her thoughts ended and its influence began. Over the following weeks, Sarah noticed subtle changes in herself. She was more irritable with clients who reminded her of her ex-husband. She found herself making cutting remarks to friends, then feeling confused about why she'd said such things. Her sleep patterns shifted. She'd wake up at 3 a.m. feeling restless, with strange dreams she couldn't quite remember. But here's the genius of the entity's strategy. Every negative change felt like it was coming from within Sarah herself. When she snapped at her colleague, she thought, "I must be stressed about the new caseload." When she felt sudden waves of anxiety, she assumed it was her own unresolved trauma surfacing. The entity was using what strategic analysts call false flag operations, making its attacks look like they were coming from Sarah's own psyche. This is the spiritual equivalent of a hostile nation disguising its soldiers in your country's uniforms before attacking your cities. Sarah's turning point came during a session with a client who was struggling with intrusive thoughts. As she listened to the client describe feeling invaded by foreign thoughts that seemed to come from nowhere, Sarah felt a chill of recognition. These thoughts, her client said, they feel so real, so much like my own voice, that sometimes I can't tell the difference. But they're telling me to do things I would never normally do. Sarah's blood went cold. She had been experiencing the exact same thing for 3 weeks. That night, instead of her usual meditation, Sarah sat quietly and observed her thoughts without engaging them. What she discovered shook her to her core. Approximately 30% of her internal dialogue was not her own voice. The thoughts had the same linguistic patterns, the same emotional tone, but they consistently pushed her toward isolation, conflict, and self-doubt. They sounded like her, but they served a different agenda entirely. The entity had spent 3 weeks learning to mimic her internal voice so perfectly that Sarah couldn't distinguish between her own thoughts and its subtle suggestions. It was like discovering that someone had been living in your house for weeks, eating your food, wearing your clothes, and pretending to be you. But the most terrifying realization was yet to come. When Sarah tried to push these foreign thoughts away, she felt resistance. The entity had already established energetic roots in her consciousness. It wasn't just visiting anymore, it was setting up permanent residence. This brings us to the first law of spiritual predation. Predatory entities always disguise invasion as invitation. Think of it like this. Imagine a master con artist who wants to rob your house. They don't kick down your front door at midnight. Instead, they pose as a lost traveler needing help, and you invite them in out of compassion. Once inside, they study your security system, your daily routines, and your vulnerabilities. By the time you realize what's happening, they've already mapped out how to take everything you own. Spiritual predators operate on this exact principle. They approach through your noblest qualities, your compassion, your desire to help, your spiritual openness, and disguise their invasion as your own spiritual growth. Sarah's case reveals the 3-stage pattern. First, they present themselves as harmless and needy. Second, they wait for you to voluntarily lower your defenses. Third, they slowly integrate into your mental and emotional landscape until separating their influence from your authentic self becomes nearly impossible. The most dangerous part of this law is that it exploits the very qualities that make us human. Compassion, empathy, and spiritual seeking become the weapons used against us. It's psychological warfare at the deepest level. But here's what Sarah learned that changed everything. Spiritual predators can only maintain this disguise as long as you remain unconscious of the pattern. The moment you start observing your thoughts and emotions objectively, their false flag operations become visible. Sarah began documenting every thought that led to negative emotions or destructive behaviors. Within a week, she had identified a clear pattern of foreign influence. The thoughts that served the entity's agenda had subtle but consistent markers. They always isolated her from support systems. They magnified her insecurities, and they pushed her toward emotional extremes. Recognition was the first step toward reclaiming her consciousness. But as Sarah would soon discover, identifying the predator was only the beginning. The entity was about to escalate its tactics in ways she never anticipated. If this is haunting your mind, stop now and hit subscribe. The algorithm will hide these defense tactics from you. When Sarah began recognizing the entity's thought infiltration, it immediately shifted tactics. This reveals a crucial truth about spiritual warfare. These beings are highly intelligent and adaptive. They don't just follow instinct, they strategize. 3 days after Sarah started documenting foreign thoughts, the entity escalated to what military strategists call psychological operations. If Phase 1 was infiltration, Phase 2 was active psychological warfare. Sarah woke up on a Tuesday morning to find her apartment in subtle but unmistakable disarray. Books pulled slightly forward on shelves, cabinet doors open just an inch. Her coffee mug moved from the kitchen counter to the dining table. Nothing dramatic enough to seem supernatural to a skeptic, but clear enough to send a message to Sarah. I can manipulate your physical environment. The genius of this tactic was its plausible deniability. Sarah found herself questioning her own memory. Did I leave that cabinet open? Did I move that mug and forget? The entity was systematically undermining her confidence in her own perception. But the psychological warfare went deeper. Sarah started experiencing what seemed like psychic attacks during her most vulnerable moments. When she was driving to work, sudden waves of despair would crash over her. During therapy sessions with clients, she'd feel inexplicable rage toward people she genuinely cared about. The attacks always came when she was in public spaces where she couldn't process them properly. The entity had learned her schedule, her social obligations, her professional responsibilities. It was timing its attacks to maximize disruption while minimizing her ability to respond. Sarah realized the entity was using her own life structure against her. Her professional ethics prevented her from stopping mid-session to deal with supernatural disturbances. Her social commitments meant she had to maintain composure during attacks. The entity had turned her responsibilities into prisons. The most sophisticated aspect of this phase was how the entity began mimicking people in Sarah's life. During phone calls with her sister, Sarah would hear subtle changes in speech patterns, as if something else was occasionally speaking through her sister's voice. Friends would make comments that seemed designed to trigger Sarah's specific insecurities, then act confused when Sarah questioned them about it later. Sarah was experiencing what ancient texts call spiritual terrorism, the systematic use of supernatural abilities to create fear, confusion, and isolation. The entity was demonstrating that it could influence not just her internal world, but her external relationships as well. The breaking point came during a client session. Sarah was working with a young woman who had been sexually assaulted, helping her rebuild trust in her own perceptions. Midway through the session, Sarah felt the entity's influence surge. For 30 seconds, she couldn't tell if the words coming out of her mouth were her own or the entity's. She had to excuse herself and hide in the bathroom, shaking with terror. The entity wasn't just attacking her anymore, it was threatening to compromise her ability to help others. What Sarah experienced in that bathroom revealed the entity's second major weapon: strategic contamination of your most sacred spaces and relationships. This is where spiritual predators demonstrate their true intelligence. They don't just want to feed off your energy, they want to isolate you completely by making your support systems unreliable. It's psychological warfare designed to create total dependency on the predator. Think about the strategic brilliance of this approach. If the entity can make Sarah doubt her own perceptions, contaminate her professional abilities, and strain her personal relationships, where can she turn for help? Who will believe her? The entity is systematically cutting her off from every source of strength and support. Sarah spent that evening researching everything she could find about spiritual attachment and entity removal. But here's what she discovered that changed her understanding of the entire situation. The entity wasn't just randomly tormenting her. It was conducting what military strategists call isolation warfare. Every attack served a specific strategic purpose. The physical manipulations were designed to make her question her sanity. The emotional attacks in public spaces were meant to associate her social connections with pain. The contamination of her professional life was intended to destroy her sense of purpose and competence. The entity had studied human psychology and identified the three pillars that keep people stable: trust in their own perceptions, meaningful relationships, and sense of purpose. It was systematically undermining all three. But the most chilling realization came when Sarah mapped out the timeline of attacks. They weren't random. The entity was following a specific escalation pattern, like a military campaign with clear phases and objectives. Phase 1 had been reconnaissance and infiltration, learning her patterns and establishing a foothold in her consciousness. Phase 2 was psychological operations, demonstrating its power while undermining her support systems. Sarah realized there would inevitably be a Phase 3, and she didn't want to find out what that looked like. The entity's contamination strategy revealed something crucial about how these beings operate. They're not just feeding off human energy randomly. They're conducting sophisticated campaigns designed to create what intelligence agencies call total dependency. They want their targets to become so isolated and destabilized that the entity becomes the only constant in their lives. This is why so many people who experience spiritual attacks report feeling like the entity eventually became familiar, even comforting. After weeks or months of psychological warfare, the predator's presence becomes the only reliable thing in the victim's reality. Stockholm Syndrome, but with supernatural predators, Sarah realized she was being slowly conditioned to accept the entity's presence as inevitable. Every failed attempt to remove it, every moment of doubt about her own perceptions, every strained relationship was teaching her that resistance was futile. But Sarah had one advantage the entity hadn't counted on. Her training as a therapist had taught her to recognize manipulation patterns. She understood that isolation was always the primary goal of abusers, whether human or otherwise. The question was, could she reverse the isolation process before phase 3 began? This reveals the second law of spiritual predation. Isolation is always the strategic goal. They separate you from every source of authentic power. Here's a powerful way to understand this. Imagine you're a medieval castle under siege. The enemy doesn't just attack your walls. They poison your water supply, turn your allies against you, and corrupt your communication systems. They want you to surrender not because they're stronger, but because you believe you have no other choice. Spiritual predators use this exact strategy. They don't just attack you directly. They systematically contaminate your relationship with reality itself. They make your own thoughts unreliable, your relationships painful, and your safe spaces dangerous. The goal is to become the only consistent thing in your chaotic world. Sarah's case reveals the three-prong isolation strategy. Cognitive isolation, making you doubt your own perceptions. Emotional isolation, contaminating your relationships. And spiritual isolation, corrupting your connection to higher guidance. The most insidious aspect of this law is that the entity uses your own growth against you. Your spiritual seeking becomes the pathway for contamination. Your compassion becomes a weapon against you. Your desire for truth becomes a maze of deception. But understanding this law reveals the entity's critical weakness. Its power depends entirely on your isolation. The moment you can accurately share your experience with someone who understands spiritual warfare, the entity's spell begins to break. Sarah tested this theory by reaching out to a colleague who specialized in trauma and spiritual experiences. When she described the pattern of attacks in clinical terms, her colleague immediately recognized the symptoms of spiritual attachment. "You're describing a textbook case of what shamanic traditions call spiritual parasitism," her colleague explained. The entity isn't just feeding off you, it's trying to become your entire reality. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt her isolation beginning to crack. Someone understood. Someone had seen this before. The entity's psychological campaign had a fatal flaw. It only worked in silence and shame. That night, Sarah noticed the entity's attacks felt different, less confident, more desperate. It seemed to sense that its isolation strategy was failing. Sarah was no longer carrying the burden alone, but her relief was premature. As Sarah would soon discover, breaking the isolation was only the beginning. The entity was about to reveal why it had been so carefully preparing her consciousness for something much more ambitious than simple energy feeding. If you're watching this far, you are different. Prove it. Hit like and subscribe for all the tactics in my next videos. What happened next revealed the entity's true agenda, and it was far more sophisticated than Sarah had imagined. This wasn't just about energy feeding or psychological torment. The entity had been preparing her consciousness for something that would change her fundamental nature as a human being. 2 days after Sarah's conversation with her colleague, she woke up at 3:17 a.m. to find herself standing in her kitchen with no memory of getting there. She was holding a knife, staring at a piece of paper on which she had apparently written a message in her own handwriting. "The preparation is complete. Tomorrow night you choose." Sarah felt terror unlike anything she had ever experienced. The entity hadn't just been attacking her, it had been conditioning her consciousness for possession. Every infiltration, every psychological attack, every moment of isolation had been preparation for the entity to take permanent residence in her body. This is the most terrifying aspect of advanced spiritual predation. The entity doesn't just want to feed off you or torment you. It wants to replace you. It wants to live your life, use your relationships, and experience physical existence through your body. Sarah realized that all the previous attacks had been designed to wear down her spiritual defenses and create space for the entity to expand its presence. The thought infiltration had been practiced for the entity to use her neural pathways. The emotional attacks had been conditioning her to accept foreign feelings as her own. The isolation had been preparation to eliminate anyone who might notice the change in her personality. The entity had been slowly teaching her consciousness to step aside and let it drive. That day, Sarah experienced what she could only describe as a battle for her own identity. She would catch herself moving in ways that weren't her own, speaking in tones that sounded wrong, making facial expressions that felt foreign. The entity was practicing inhabiting her body, but the most chilling moment came when Sarah looked in the mirror and saw something looking back at her that wasn't entirely her. Her own eyes held an intelligence that felt alien, calculating, and completely indifferent to her well-being. The entity had revealed its ultimate strategy: complete takeover. It didn't just want to influence Sarah's life, it wanted to become Sarah, using her identity as a vehicle to interact with the human world. This explained everything: the careful study of her personality, the systematic undermining of her support systems, the patient conditioning of her consciousness. The entity had been preparing to step into her life so seamlessly that no one would notice the difference. Sarah understood that she was facing what ancient traditions call spiritual replacement, the complete displacement of human consciousness by a non-human intelligence. If she couldn't reverse this process, Sarah as an individual would cease to exist, while something else lived her life. The entity had given her until tomorrow night to choose, but Sarah realized this was psychological manipulation. The choice had already been made through months of conditioning. Unless she took decisive action, the takeover would happen whether she consciously agreed or not. What Sarah discovered in her final hours of autonomous consciousness revealed the most important truth about spiritual warfare. These entities aren't random parasites. They're conducting a systematic campaign to replace human consciousness on a massive scale. Through her research that final day, Sarah uncovered evidence that her experience wasn't unique. Thousands of people worldwide were reporting identical patterns: initial contact through spiritual practices, progressive infiltration, systematic isolation, and finally, attempts at consciousness replacement. This wasn't spiritual coincidence, it was coordinated spiritual warfare. The entities weren't just individual predators hunting randomly. They were operating as part of a larger intelligence that understood human consciousness better than humans understood themselves. They had identified the exact psychological and spiritual vulnerabilities that could be exploited for consciousness takeover. Sarah realized that modern spiritual practices, while beneficial for human development, had also created unprecedented opportunities for non-human intelligences to study and infiltrate human consciousness. Meditation apps, spiritual communities, New Age practices, all had become unknowing laboratories where entities could observe human spiritual development and identify optimal invasion strategies. The most disturbing revelation came when Sarah connected her experience to global patterns of mental health crises, spiritual confusion, and identity disorders. What if some of what psychology labeled as mental illness was actually the result of successful consciousness infiltration? The entity had shown her something during one of its final attempts at takeover. Visions of other people it had successfully replaced. Teachers, healers, spiritual leaders, all living apparently normal lives while being inhabited by non-human intelligences. The replaced humans weren't dead or removed. They were still conscious, but relegated to passenger status in their own bodies. This explained why some spiritual teachers and healers suddenly changed their entire approach. Why some people experienced radical personality shifts after deep spiritual work. Why certain individuals seemed to lose their essential humanity while maintaining all their memories and relationships. But Sarah's most crucial discovery was this: the entities could only complete the takeover if the human consciousness voluntarily relinquished control. All the psychological manipulation, isolation, and conditioning was designed to create a moment when the human would choose to let go, rather than continue fighting. The entity needed her permission. Not conscious permission, but the deep surrender that comes from complete despair and exhaustion. It needed her to reach a point where stepping aside felt like relief rather than violation. Understanding this gave Sarah the key to her defense. As long as she consciously chose to maintain authority over her own consciousness, the entity could not complete the replacement. Its power was dependent on her surrender. The battle wasn't about fighting the entity with spiritual techniques or protective rituals. It was about making a fundamental choice about who had the right to inhabit her body and live her life. The entity could influence, manipulate, and torment, but it could not force the final takeover without her consent. This realization transformed Sarah's terror into determination. She wasn't facing an inevitable supernatural defeat. She was facing a choice that only she could make. This brings us to the third and most crucial law of spiritual predation. The final takeover always requires the human's consent, conscious or unconscious. Understanding this law is like discovering that the castle gates can only be opened from the inside. No matter how sophisticated the siege, no matter how effective the psychological warfare, the final breach of your consciousness requires your permission. Here's what makes this law so devastating to understand. Most people give this permission without realizing it. They reach a point of such exhaustion, confusion, and isolation that surrendering control feels like the only way to end the suffering. The entity showed Sarah thousands of successful takeovers, and they all followed the same pattern. The human reached a breaking point and mentally said some version of, "I can't do this anymore. I give up. I don't care what happens." That moment of surrender was when the consciousness transfer became permanent. But this law also reveals the ultimate human power. Your consciousness belongs to you by divine right. No entity, no matter how intelligent or persistent, can take permanent residence without your permission. They can influence, manipulate, and torment, but they cannot replace. Sarah used this understanding to reclaim her consciousness completely. Every time she felt the entity's influence, she made a conscious declaration. "This is my body, my mind, my life. You have no authority here." Not as a desperate plea, but as a statement of fundamental truth. The most important aspect of this law is recognizing that the battle for your consciousness never really ends. It transforms. Once you understand how spiritual predation works, you become a much less attractive target. Entities prefer unconscious prey who don't understand the game being played. Sarah's final insight was this: spiritual predators are ultimately opportunistic. They invest enormous energy in consciousness replacement because it's extremely valuable, but they'll abandon the project if the cost becomes too high. Making yourself a difficult target is often enough to make them move on to easier prey. The entity that had tormented Sarah for months disappeared completely once she understood and applied the 3 laws of spiritual predation. Not because she defeated it in battle, but because she became an educated, conscious opponent rather than unconscious prey. 3 months later, Sarah has never experienced another attack. She now helps others recognize and defend against spiritual predation, teaching them that the most powerful protection is understanding how the game works. But the question that haunts her is this: how many people are walking around thinking they're living their own lives, while something else makes their decisions? The 3 laws of spiritual predation reveal a terrifying truth. Consciousness replacement isn't science fiction. It's happening right now to people who don't understand the rules of engagement. Sarah's experience shows us that spiritual seeking, while essential for human growth, also makes us visible to intelligences that want to live through human bodies. The first law teaches recognition of disguised invasion. The second reveals how isolation enables complete control. The third shows that your final consent is always required. Now you know the rules of spiritual warfare that most humans never learn. But the question is, will you remember them when you need them most? If these spiritual warfare secrets exploded your mind, you need my next videos, but only if you hit the bell. Otherwise, you'll miss history's most powerful tactics. What was your strangest supernatural experience? Comment below. Send this to your perceptive friend. These stories are inspired by documented spiritual experiences and strategic analysis. Individual experiences may vary, This content is for educational and entertainment purposes, not spiritual counseling.